talk a little bit about some studio technology. This is going to be very basic, just some casual conversation. With me, I've got Albert from Rocket Broadcaster. We've got Jerry Butler with us from MusicMaster, and Wes from the Live 365 team. So I wanted to go around the room real quick. You guys can introduce yourselves and say a quick hello and talk a little bit about what you do. Albert, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, I'm Albert from Rocket Broadcaster. I'm a software developer and entrepreneur, and I'm here representing my streaming audio encoder, a Rocket Broadcaster, which is the software that takes your audio from your local PC and sends it over to a streaming service like Live 365.
Nice. Jerry, how are you?
Good. Jerry Butler with MusicMaster. I'm Vice President of Sales. I work with stations all over the United States, Canada, on terrestrial signals as well as streams, and help them make great radio.
Nice. That's what we like to hear. Wes, how's it going?
Good. I don't have any video, folks, because I'll be sharing my screen later, but I'm Wes Simkins. I'm a senior product consultant for Live 365. I'm in the OTA division, which is over-the-air stations catering to terrestrial broadcasters. And I've been around this, let me see, I got started in 1999 and moved into my own company in 2004, and we've been going strong ever since.
Nice. I feel like most of us, we've been doing this for what seems like most of our lives. So we've got several questions that have come in already. And a lot of this is going to be, pretty basic stuff, but I feel some of it's going to apply to somebody, but not maybe somebody else. So we'll just kind of go around the room here. First one I had up on here is, I feel like we can already open in a can of worms here. Software versus hardware encoders. I feel like this is kind of go a little bit towards Albert's wheelhouse a little bit. We'll kind of go around the room here. Software versus hardware encoders, which is better, pros and cons of each, that sort of thing.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is a big can of worms, and I think every broadcaster probably has their own opinion on it. As a maker of a software encoder, I'm partial to the software side. In general, there's all sorts of different pros and cons of each. In the big picture, software is always more flexible than hardware, and that can confer a number of advantages for broadcasters. Like typically, we're able to just move quite a bit faster than hardware manufacturers are, so we're able to integrate with new services, integrate with more hardware, and software it's portable. If your PC breaks, you can just copy it over, install Rocket Broadcaster, your encoder on a different computer, and be up and running in minutes. It doesn't require specialized hardware. PCs and laptops, sound cards, everything's just a commodity now. Hardware, on the other hand, is it's more self-contained. It can be easier to set up. You can have less moving parts. It can be harder to set up. Certain hardware, the advantage of hardware encoders, sometimes they can have specialized features such as like redundant power supplies. And that can be things people look for in really high-end studio environments. People talk also about reliability. There's a lot of myths about, I think, the reliability of hardware encoders. People think hardware is magically more reliable than software. But today, the reality is that every hardware encoder is a little embedded computer. They're all running embedded Linux or some embedded operating system. There's no real hardware encoding as it were 10 or 15 years ago. They don't even make like hardware and MP3 encoder chips anymore. That doesn't exist. It's all done in software, even on the little hardware embedded encoders. And for any sort of critical setup, you'd always want to have, say, redundant hardware. So maybe redundant hardware encoders or redundant PCs, software, hardware. So I think they're the same in many respects. And lastly, I think a big thing for us is that usually it takes more time for a hardware vendor to produce a new firmware update. Say a customer discovers a bug or they need some new feature integration. With software, we can pump out an update in an hour. I can turn around an update for a customer in an hour if there's a bug. And that's just typically not even close to what you're looking at for hardware updates. The firmware there's a number of reasons why that is, but with software, there's no risk of me like bricking your device or something if I send you a new version of Rocket Broadcaster. But with hardware, there's more QA involved, and things by necessity have to move a little bit slower.
So say a station is going to be looking to sort of update their encoders, or using something that's sort of outdated, maybe something from like the late 90s or something. In this day and age, what are some must-have? I mean, an encoder, it's pretty simple. It's basically taking audio and sending it to a server, but there's a lot of features that go along with that. So what would you say are some absolute like must-have, like have to have features for a modern day audio encoder?
DSP is really important. I think that's an area where you can save a lot of money if your hardware encoder can also do some processing changes and all sorts of stuff like that. Like broadcast processing hardware used to be very, very expensive, and now you can replace it with a $50 or $100 VST plugin in software. You can save a tremendous amount of money. Also, supporting modern codecs like Opus. I think throughout the panels, this has come up a couple of times that we all really hope that Opus is the future codec, and we'd like to see, I think, every piece of hardware and software support that, and the whole ecosystem support that. So looking for things like that, I think is key as well.
Cool. Wes or Jerry, I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with this sort of thing, but if you guys wanted to chime in, certainly you're able to do so if you want to.
Sure, I'd have to agree with Albert on that. Software generally is more agile. You're able to update that much faster than a hardware situation. Really doesn't matter which way you go, whether it's hardware or software. You have to have stable operating systems. You have to have stable equipment, no matter what you're running. And I think that's really comes down to the key on either way you decide to go. I think you have to have stable equipment.
Yep, absolutely. So when it comes to a lot of these encoders now, and as far as streaming goes and licensing and things like that, it's absolutely necessary to have good metadata. So when you're talking about metadata coming from, some sort of, automation or playout system and getting it to the encoder, what are some of the methods and processes to getting the data from sort of your playout system to, the encoder, whether it be hardware or software?
As far as the metadata on the MusicMaster side, anything that you put into MusicMaster, artist, title, album information, which is required when you're streaming, that can be exported out directly to your playout system. We've got a live integration, an interface with Live 365 that makes that very usable and very easy to set up. That information is transferred and encoded from MusicMaster directly to Live 365, but at the same time, MusicMaster can export a log to a playout system that can then go to another system to send that out over a stream as well. So we work with both sides of it. The key to all of your metadata is keeping it up to date, keeping it current, and making sure that everything is complete. And of course, there's regulations on that as well. Live 365 is great about watching artist title and album information, but you can add a lot more information into MusicMaster's side and control that flow and the sound of your station, controlling things like mood and energy and tempo. If you get into classical stations, they may have things like instrumentation and soloists. So MusicMaster, you can expand very easily, and that metadata can grow as well. I think that's extremely important. And then what exports out, whether you're using an XML format that's going to an automation or playout system, or you're exporting out a log and the playout system is sending that XML format out to an encoder or anything else. I think either way, whether it's on the hardware side for the playout or the music scheduling side, you have to make sure all that metadata is in there and included.
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as the metadata itself, and the at least on the encoder side, um, Albert, I know you, for example, Rocket will support pretty much everything under the sun. What would you say, um, in terms of actually getting the data, would be the most reliable? I've seen it done via a text file, like TCP XML. I've seen it done over FTP of all things. So I mean, from your point of view, what would you say would be, the most reliable way of getting that data?
Right. So just for me to give more context for the audience. So typically, if you have a radio automation application playing some music, every time there's a new track, there's new metadata now playing metadata, like typically just the artist and title. And for that information to show up in your stream, the streaming audio encoder has to get that information from your radio automation software. So there's usually a little bit of setup involved there where you need to configure your automation to send that metadata over to the encoder somehow. And it works a little bit different with every different encoder and radio automation application. So what we're talking about now is some of those methods. Usually, I think the big couple are, you can have the automation send the metadata over TCP, UDP. So these are network protocols, or just write the metadata to a text file, and then the encoder can try to check it every couple of seconds or watch the disk for changes and just magically slurp that up. So even if your radio automation software and your encoder are running on the same PC, you can still use one of these network protocols. So generally, we do try to lean towards TCP or UDP. I think TCP is the best approach today. The reason is, so there's generally it's more about downsides to the other approaches. With text file watching, sometimes you can get into trouble if you have, say, you're saving a text file to a network share. If you want to have metadata working all the time, you have to now make sure that that network share, on your Windows network is up all the time, I mean, from looking at a lot of log files, that's not always true in a lot of studios. And with UDP, it's an unreliable protocol. So although it's unlikely, there's a possibility that metadata could be lost. With TCP, it's slightly less likely. And it's easier to set up, I think, the TCP approach if you have your streaming audio encoder running on a different PC or it's a different piece of hardware compared to where your radio automation is running. So that's the way to go. And I think in terms of format, it doesn't really matter. There's all sorts of XML, all sorts of different text file formats. Some sort of XML format's good, but you're really at the mercy of whatever your automation software has, and they're all competitive in terms of what they output generally. And the last thing to watch out for is the text encoding. This is the secret thing that a lot of setups miss, is that you need to ensure that the text encoding, which is how the characters are actually represented in binary, you have to make sure that they're speaking really the same language, the automation and the encoder. And that's something where sometimes they can be speaking slightly different variants, and everything will be fine if it's in English, just using regular characters, like English language characters. But as soon as there's accented characters and stuff like that, people can often see some garbled output in the metadata, and that's always a text encoding mismatch. So that's a thing to always watch out for if you're ever setting this up.
Yeah, definitely. I've run into that a time or two myself. Now this will be something for, I think, all three of you can probably chime in a little bit. In recent times, within the past couple of years or so, what would you say has been probably the biggest change or even an innovation when it comes to studio technology, whether it be software, hardware, encoders, playout systems, anything you can think of as far as innovations go? Yeah, what would you think biggest changes there, I would say? Because it's definitely changed a lot over, I mean, in my time, just in the past, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years, there's been some huge changes.
I would have to agree with Albert, Cam. The big changes that I've seen in the encoding is being able to use the DSP and do your actual audio encoding through the encoder. And I've seen that come a long way. And I've seen it come from systems that were separate that ate up all your CPU. So you had to run them on different systems so that you didn't destroy your automation system, to now where everything has become lightweight, but yet it sounds fantastic. And you can use it on one computer, which becomes pretty important when you get into a virtual environment, which is what I specialize in, is in the virtual world. So I agree with Albert on that part. He said it perfectly earlier.
Yeah, speaking of the virtual world, this is something that has, I mean, I'll chime in as well. In recent times, I've started doing that myself. I run a couple of stations personally, and instead of having a full-blown studio out of my house or wherever, you can run it all in the cloud on a virtual machine running Windows or whatever. And since everything is so lightweight, you can run, you can do all your processing, your encoding, your playout, everything all on one machine, and it's not, you're not completely slamming your CPU to 100% the entire time. So I think that's something that's certainly come a long way. I remember back, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you'd try to run any sort of decent processing on any sort of computer, and you were pushing it to its limits just for audio processing. So just in the past few years, the efficiency has come down a long way. So that's definitely where I would stand on that.
Yeah, and I think, in a nutshell, the kind of rapid digitization of audio, that's really been happening in the last 5 or 10 years. That's been a huge change, and it looks different, depending. It's both different for hobbyists and smaller studios than it is for larger studios and radio networks. Well, one thing that I've been hearing from larger organizations is, I think specifically in the last 5 years, is the development and like the widespread use of a standard called AES 67, or audio over IP. This is something that many radio stations are using internally now. It's a completely different technology where, rather than routing all your audio through all these analog cables, you're able to have digital audio natively running over Ethernet cables and switches, and it's all basically broadcast throughout this entire, you have like a dedicated network basically of Ethernet cables, and all your audio is broadcast to all the devices available on the network all the time. And so what this means is, like, if you have a AES 67 microphone, you plug it in, and on the 3rd floor of your building downstairs, you want to pick it up, it's just instantly available on the network. So you're able to do all this routing and software. And I think that's been a tremendous, from what I've heard, it's been a huge advance, big step forward for broadcasters working in larger organizations.
I think being able just to have remote access to so many different platforms, like you said, now somebody can go in and start a stream fairly easily, and really not very expensive either. 10 years ago, it was unheard of for an individual to have a hobby, as a hobbyist, to start their own stream and do this type of thing. Now you can have a great sounding stream with the processing. You can have remote access through different platforms, be able to control, in MusicMaster, even if you forgot to schedule your stream and you're playing the audio through our encoder, you can leave that and it has just-in-time scheduling. So it picks it up as that log ends from the day before. And so many things have been dropped down to the level that a hobbyist can afford and can control on, in their local home office. And so I think that's a huge aspect that has changed over the last 10 years, not only pricing, but making it available to somebody that can do this on a smaller scale.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you brought up MusicMaster there, because this is actually going to be one of my next talking points, is the importance of having a good scheduling software for building out your rotations and your clocks, rather than just having something like, an auto DJ where it's just going to pick songs at random, sort of like a jukebox. Why would something like MusicMaster or any good scheduling software be important in this day and age?
Well, MusicMaster gives you more control over the audio and the music that you're playing. Any software is going to be able to try to separate, tempos, possibly artist separation. With MusicMaster, you can control the artist separation, the tempos, the album separation, which, come under the requirements. If you're going to be streaming audio, you can only play so many cuts by an artist or an album within a certain amount of time. And so I think that's a huge factor, and MusicMaster helps you manage that. In addition, you can control things like new music intros that you don't have to hand place and have this artist introducing the brand new song that you're about to go into. You can set that up as an automated feature within MusicMaster. You can control not only the tempos, but even the liners and imaging that goes into the song. So, from people that work terrestrial radio for years, you understand what talking up to a ramp and hitting a post is. And that's basically where you're talking up to where the vocals start in a song. MusicMaster can actually control that with imaging to overlap that intro of a song and hit that post. It makes your audio sound very tight. It makes your radio station sound very produced. And MusicMaster can make that as very an automated process where you don't have to hand place everything day to day. You can have a very, controlled log that sounds, smooth, and you get the sound that you want out of it. Controlling moods, controlling energy, artist separation, whatever that may be. We see stations that, and that depends on your format, that you may have a very current based top 40 or urban station that you have artist separation as low as 8 or 10, 15 minutes, because every artist is playing on another artist song. Where you go to someone like a classical station and you're looking at a conductor. I mean, literally, we have classical stations that may not, they literally could go a year without repeating the same piece. So it differs from format to format and what you need. And that's what a good scheduling software can adapt to. And MusicMaster allows for that, not only in the control, but also the number of fields and different items that you can control.
Yeah, absolutely. Said that perfectly. So Wes, as somebody who actually runs an over-the-air radio station, how is this something, do you utilize, these sort of softwares to keep, to keep things sounding, professional and separated and, things of that nature?
Well, basically, we came up with the idea of doing everything virtually, because the station that I inherited is in Oregon, Hill County, Oregon, and my office is right outside of Louisville, Kentucky. So I had to have a way to control the station, and of course, we've got local folks there. COVID-19 hit, for instance. Now we don't want people in the studio. Okay, everybody has to work from home. Fortunately, our station uses Station Playlist Pro, and we have the capability of doing remote voice tracking. I do all that through the internet. We do keep our stuff up to date via Dropbox, so it is kind of a pain in the rear, because I have to make sure I have a virtual server here that does our file copy for news, weather, and sports, and inserts it into the station. So I have to make sure Dropbox is on, because as you probably know, Dropbox doesn't really support Windows Server applications. It's more based for the individual Windows machine at your house. So one of the things I have to do daily is log into my virtual servers, make sure Dropbox is talking and everything's fine. And then my guys and gals have the ability to go ahead and pre-record their shows and make them sound live. And it's all done through a virtual network, and it works very, very well. Our scheduling software, which we are using Playlist Creator right now, we may change up later, but it will give us the top up. So if someone runs a few minutes short, it'll automatically top up a song out of a pre-selected category and play it over the air. And the listeners don't even know that happened. It's all done in the background. All of our processing is now done through a machine, and it's at the transmitter site. Everything's sent. All the audio is sent over the internet and collected there and then transmitted. It's pretty complex system, but really it's simple. It was very, very simple to set up and get running. We're proud of the fact that we're able to use what we're using. I've got people doing constant updates in the local community in Yamhill County, Oregon, about COVID-19. Of course, we're speaking to the mayor of McMinnville. We're talking to the Oregon Health Authority. We're talking to all these people. They put it in and boom, it's automatically fed into the system there at the transmitter building, and it goes out over the air, and it just sounds like they're on the street reporting. So, and they don't even leave their home. You know, they're social distancing and what do they call that? Self-quarantining. So, and nobody even knows in McMinnville, nobody even knows there's nobody in the KLYC office. So I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from you guys over the years, Cam. And so I took that virtual environment that you guys helped me build back several years ago at Empire, and I put that into play in an actual over-the-air terrestrial radio station, and it works quite well.
And I'm glad you mentioned voice tracking, more importantly, remote voice tracking, especially, you know, with the state of the world and the pandemic and things like that. There's a whole group of people out there, especially who are, you know, diehard veteran radio folks who say voice tracking isn't real radio and blah, blah, blah. You have to do everything live. And on my end, I would absolutely disagree with that because, for example, in Wes's case, he's keeping a station on the air. He's keeping, his on-air staff. Everybody still has a job. He's keeping his community informed. Nobody's off the air, and everybody is staying out of the office. They're staying at home and they're staying safe. So I'm glad you brought that up as far as voice tracking is concerned. So I would absolutely agree with you there.
To me, without voice tracking, I don't really think any of the stations. I mean, I see it promoted daily in Radio World and other publications about how to move to more of the VoIP and voice track to make it sound live or to actually go live. We do have the capability of actually going live. We can even do live remotes. But of course, that puts my staff at risk of contracting the coronavirus, which is something we don't want because we're more of a classic hits and oldies station. And quite honestly, my guys have been in the industry 50 plus years, and I had to train them how to voice track because they're always used to going to the studio, but they're just tickled pink. And I'm talking guys, one of my DJs is 75 years old. So I don't want him out in the public. So voice tracking is just the way of the world right now.
I mean, there's a lot of advantages to it. Number one, like the whole remote feature, everybody stays, social distancing and everything like that. But number two, it saves a lot of time. You can track a 4-hour show in 10 minutes and then you're done. And as long as you voice track it and you do it correctly, like you said, Wes, the listeners don't know the difference that no one's there in the office or not.
Well, we can talk over, talk under. We can do anything with our voice tracking software. So it sounds like you're actually, it sounds like the station is actually spinning records. And then you get the DJ talking, the next song fades in while he's talking. He's doing a little talk over. He can talk over on the outgoing track, the incoming track, and it does. And it sounds wonderful. I mean, we've got them set up. They have good microphones. We've always made sure that they do sound checks to make sure everything sounds highly professional. But I mean, even what's so cool about this is, we deal with a lot of pure play broadcasters, internet only, and they're able to create that same quality that we create, and they're creating that quality at $79 a month, that quality that costs us $5,000-6,000 a month to put on the air, and it's just amazing.
Yep, I agree with that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of some of the even the larger pure players. They're doing that times 40 or 50. They're throwing up 40, 50 stations at a time, and they all sound fantastic. This one person running 40, 50 stations. I mean, the scale of it is pretty crazy, and it's super affordable. So I definitely, as far as innovation goes, the remote aspect of this is, I think, is really incredible. I do have a couple more things, and I don't want to go too long because I don't know if we have had any questions yet. Remember, if you're an attendee in the Zoom, if you click on the Q&A down at the bottom, if you have any questions for for any one of our panelists or about anything with studio technology in general, you can go ahead and put your question down in there, and we'll go ahead and try to get to those at the end. And I think I did also want to, I'm not sure quite how long this is going to take. I wanted to get back to metadata a little bit. And I know this is something Wes has a lot of experience with. So for me on the Live 365 side, we have a lot of, smaller guys who want to run syndicated programming, but they can't necessarily do that easily because the syndicated programming, the folks who put those out, they basically will give you one long MP3 file and say, here you go, play this. And it's got all the tracks there in one file all done for you. And you can't get the metadata out like that, not very easily anyway. So luckily, their cue sheets have come along, and Wes is I think that's something you're pretty experienced with. So I did want to talk to you a little bit about that and find out. I've never even looked at a cue sheet in my life, so I'm not sure what it is or how it functions.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll share my screen and we'll go through that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Quick. It'll be a real fast thing.
Go for it. And just to note, we can run over. There's nothing in this room at the top of the hour, so if we go a little bit over, that's not a problem.
Okay.
All right. We want to talk about why metadata is important here. I get asked a lot of times about, because I was in the Pure Play section of Live 365, and people always ask about running syndicated programming. To most internet broadcasters, they want to run a podcast, and podcast has a ton of music in it. So I have to explain to them why the metadata is important. Number one, it's used for reporting performances, and the data can be collected in real time. And what people need to understand, performances are determined by session start, not by amount of time listened, okay? That's why the data needs to be collected in real time, and that's why Live 365 requires the metadata to be sent. Okay, and like I said, I get one of the biggest questions, the questions asked the most often is, can I use syndicated programming on my internet radio station? And the answer to that is yes, but it has a big if, the biggest, smallest big word in the English language. If you use syndicated programming, you must have a way to send metadata in your stream so that we can collect performance data to be supplied to the performance rights organization. In order to do that, you're going to need an automation system or playout system, depending on what part of the world you're from, that supports the use of cue files, .cue files, which are cue sheets. The only two internet-only automation systems that I'm aware of at this point, now I could be wrong, but I've been trying to investigate this further, are Nextcast Pro and Station Playlist. So we're kind of limited to the playout systems that we can use if we're going to use syndicated programming. So my advice to Live 365, pure play broadcasters is you need to go into, use one of these play out systems or automation systems, and you'll have to go into live stream mode. You're not going to be able to load them into your cloud schedule. Okay. So we'll have to go to live stream mode in order to make this work. All right. So how do I make a Q file? I use a program on my PC that was developed in 2009, and it's called Music Cue Sheet Generator. It's written by a gentleman named Ben Thomas, and he's an actual musician that came up with this. Very amazing. All right. The program generates the file for me. So the Q files go into the same folder as the MP3 files or WAV files, okay? And they have to be named the same as the MP3. So let's say, for instance, I use MG Kelly programming on the weekends, all right? And what they'll send me is different segments, and they'll be named by the hour in the segment. So I've got hour 1 segment 1.mp3. My Q file is going to be named hour 1 segment 1.cue. Now, let me jump out of this. I'm going to show you real quick. This is the program I was talking about, Music Cue Sheet Generator. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
All right. So when I download the program, I'm going to use Classic Hit List by MG Kelly, for instance. When I download that music into the folder, that's how it comes in, okay? And then they send me what they call their cue sheet. Well, it's not really a cue sheet because this is what it looks like. So what I do to make it simple is I copy this information right here. And we're only going to do one quick segment. I copy that into a text file that already has my information ready to go. So I simply take this information. We know the mix artist and the mix title is going to be MG Kelly. And it's Classic Hit List. Now we're in there. So what we have to do now is we have to get ready to build our cue. Now, what I do is I set the first part of the segment to tell people this is Classic Hit List. And then at the end of that, Rocky would be proud of me. I put in my trigger file.
Now, this is for folks who are doing ad insertion. This is a lot of folks on, for example, Live 365, they'll be doing, if you have an ad enabled plan, you have to send these triggers. So you have to send the metadata for the triggers. And that's what this is.
Yeah.
It's specific metadata that triggers the ads on the server side. And if this metadata is not coming through during the show, then you're not going to get your ads. And therefore, you're not satisfying the requirements either on Live 365 or whoever your content or hosting provider is if they require this sort of thing.
So MG Kelly gives me, they use 2 minutes. They get 2 minutes because this is on a barter. And then I get 2 minutes for the station, okay? So on that 2 minutes, when I'm on my stream, I want to use my Live 365 ad break trigger, the metadata to trigger that ad when people are listening to the stream. Now, people that are listening over the air are going to hear something totally different. They're going to hear an ad break set, but the people that are listening online are going to get the national ads from Live 365. So in my first segment, they've given me these artists and these song titles. So I put them into my cue sheet. Now you see the cue sheet starts at David Bowie, all right? So then I simply load my track, hour 1, segment 1, and it starts to play. I go past. Then I set my cue to David Bowie. Now I can move forward. There's my next song. There goes my next one. There's that one. Now I'll forward through and to where they're going to get ready to start their ad break set.
The boys from Beantown gave that song to bring up a singer-songwriter whose first album was recorded at the wrong speed. Whoa, slow down, where are you going? That and a lot more when the classic hit list returns.
Boom. That's my out cue. All right. So now I just did the first segment of a 4-hour show, and it didn't take me very long. All right. And I even got my ad break triggers in there. I saved my cue sheet. Now let's go back to our folder. Look at there. Hour 1 segment 1.cue. And since we are recording this, if anybody wants a quick run through on that, they can just watch the recording. I also made a tutorial video on this for Live 365, and anybody that wants to get that tutorial, they can hit me up, wsimkins@live365.com, and I'll be able to, I'll be glad to get that over to you. And it's more in depth on how to build cue sheets. But let me stop my screen share. Now we're back.
So once you have your cue sheet, is it really simple to, I mean, I'm not sure what the process is like. I've not done it to get that cue sheet to actually to integrate it with the automation system and sort of, you know, play out as the show is playing. I mean, the cue sheet and the file that's playing, they start at the same time, I imagine.
Yes, it's all triggered by the song, by the segment start. That folder that you were just seeing, that file just synced to my server. Okay, so when station playlists start segment 1, hour 1, segment 1, it automatically sees the cue file. So instead of just sending what is there on the main file, it goes through and times it, because my cues just were timed. Okay, and that's the metadata it sends. It sends the information I just loaded into that cue sheet. Now, it may seem like a lot of work. Now, if somebody's wanting to run a 2-hour show, you're going to have to do that and click through all those times on a 2-hour show so that your playout system can send the metadata that Live 365 requires for performance reporting. You see what I'm saying there, Cam?
Yeah, excellent. I think it's going to help a lot of people out because that's like you said, that's a common question I get. They've got these syndicated shows, and sometimes that's a deal breaker for them. If I can't run these shows, then I can't use your service. So I'm really glad that, you know, this sort of thing exists, and I'm glad that you showed us how to do that. I've never seen that before, so I'm really thankful for that. So I super appreciate that.
You know, I'm not trying to sell for Station Playlist Pro or Nextcast Pro, but these automation systems have become extremely affordable. And
those are the only ones that can do it as of right now.
As of right now, they're the only ones that I know. Maybe Jerry knows of another.
You know, I don't. I haven't heard anything, but I will check after today because this is the first time that I've seen that program you used to create those cue lists. So I thought that was fantastic, but I will be checking with all of our automation partners.
I know somebody had mentioned a PAL script for Sam Broadcaster, but I have yet to find that PAL script to use with Sam.
I've never seen it either. If I can interject, though, I know there's one of our awesome community guys in the Live 365 broadcaster group who has an open source software which does something very similar, but it's definitely not as refined as what you showed us, Wes. So I think there's a couple other like experimental things out there, but this is definitely a robust solution for this situation for sure.
Well, there's several ways that you can build cue sheets, and I have found this little program. I just stumbled across it because I was Googling, and the one I was using, their system went down and I couldn't build cue sheets for my weekend show, and I was freaking out. This was 2 years ago. I'm freaking out. So I stumbled across this one. I said, oh man, it's so easy to use. Why not use it? And it's free.
As far as I mean, that's my motto. If it's free, it's for me. So I appreciate that. If there's anything that's for free out there, um, I think I've always known about cue sheets, but I didn't know necessarily the inner workings of them or how to build them easily. I mean, as far as I was aware, a cue sheet is simply a text file that has, you know, the name, and it's nothing more than, the name with a timestamp in it, and that's it. But I never knew an easy way to actually build those out. So I'm glad that there's software out there that exists that allows, an end user like any hobbyist broadcaster to build them, easily and seamlessly like that. So I think that's fantastic.
Very, very easy to do.
We're going to be running a little bit short on time here. We've got about 5-6 minutes left. Couple of things here. I know this was about studio technology, and something that's I've been sort of thinking about is what really defines a studio. Like, what is a studio to you? So, I mean, it's kind of an open-ended question here. I mean, in my opinion, a studio is basically anything where you're, sort of producing something. So there's many different forms of a studio, like an art studio that an artist would have. They're producing something. They're producing paintings or drawings or whatever. A radio studio, we're producing some form of audio content. But there's a lot of pieces to that, a lot of building blocks. So what would you say would be the definition of a studio, and what are some of the building blocks of a studio? Jerry, I see you unmuted, so you were ready to answer.
I think that's kind of a trick question, and it goes back to what we've talked about as far as the advances. 10 years ago, you had to have a lot of hardware, you had to have software, and more importantly, a lot of expense. Everything is on a smaller profile now. What has changed the most in the last 10, 15, 20 years? Cell phones have changed everything. So many people can control their scheduling off of a cell phone, or turning a transmitter on or off of a cell phone, controlling the radio stations off of a cell phone or remote access. What is a studio? I've traveled all over the place with MusicMaster, and I've voice tracked shows from a hotel room with a mic and a laptop, and that was my studio at that moment. So I think what we looked at a studio 10 years ago is vastly different than what we see it today. It's interesting because everything has become more affordable for the hobbyist. Even with MusicMaster, you can get MusicMaster, the exact same software that a major market station in New York City or LA is using, and you can use that to schedule your pure play stream. It's the exact same software. So, you see this with automation systems, you see it with the encoders. Everything has changed over the last 10 years. So I think the studio has changed. Now that we're talking virtual environments, your studio can be anywhere in the world, and you can take care of it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that about cell phones. And I see Dane there in the chat. He just said a 4G cell, a laptop, and a mic, and there you go. And this day and age, look at this. You see what I'm holding up right here? You know what this is? This is a studio right here. I mean, for some people, this is a studio.
Well,
so
I can attest to that, because we do a lot of live high school sports on KLYC. And the way we do those sports is, I'll use Amity School District for an example. Jeff Clark, the superintendent of schools, he does play-by-play action for us live on the air. And we literally have a 4G cell phone, a small, very small soundboard, and 2 headset mics, and him and his co-host, they call those games live. And I pull them in through a virtual audio cable, send them through the line in, out over the transmitter, and people are listening to live sports right off of a cell phone.
It's incredible. And nowadays, you don't even need to have the soundboard. There's virtual soundboards you can use. For example, Voice Meter Banana. This is getting back to what we were talking about earlier. Everything is virtualized now. You can have a virtual soundboard right on your computer where you control the levels of everybody's microphone right there on your screen. No hardware, and it's free. So,
absolutely.
I mean, just as far as, I mean, the way that technology has progressed is in the past few years, I think is it still to me is mind blowing, really.
I still have 10 FCC STL licenses for live sports. We haven't used that tower in years.
Yep. Yep. Not necessary. So we are running up against the clock. Opening up another can of worms here on the very last question. I don't see anything as far as audience questions yet. If you have any, get those in. We're going to run out of time here. Last question from me, and we're going to open up the big box here. Codecs, MP3 versus AAC versus whatever. Is MP3 dead? I know, Albert, you're talking a little bit about this earlier, so I'm sure you could go on forever about this, but is it time for MP3 to go bye-bye, or is there still a place for it?
I think it's dead. I definitely think it's dead. People say it's the most compatible still, but I disagree with that. I think AAC will play on anything made in the last decade. No problem, it's dead. But, you know, and I wish Opus would take over, and maybe it will, but there's still, you know, some holdouts, particularly from Apple, which is a shame. But I think definitely actually in the studio professional environment, Opus is taking over for sure. But in terms of that delivery of digital audio to like the end user, seems like AAC is where it's at today. MP3 is dead, and Opus may or may not be the future there. That's what my 2 cents.
But I remember when people said that about OGG too.
Yeah.
So what are the advantages? Like, why is it better than MP3? I mean, the abbreviated version anyway.
Well, it sounds better, and you get more bang for your buck. It sounds better at lower bit rates, so you get more reliable. You know, the lower the bit rate, the more reliable the stream for listeners on mobile, and so you get better sounding stream, and it's going to be more reliable. And with Opus, the big draw is that it's all patent free, so it lowers the cost of all the hardware, all the software, all that stuff. Whereas AAC is still patent encumbered. So
I use AAC for my mobile streams because, and the reason is I did a course on this, gosh, many years ago. We had a webinar, an audio webinar on this, and I had Greg from Orban on the audio webinar. And the way AAC works is I can take a 320K file, compress it down to 64K going out for my mobile listener. And when it gets to the other end, it expands into the quality of 320K. And I think that's what drew me so much to AAC, HEAAC, AACP, whatever you want to call it nowadays. But Greg actually convinced me of that. And of course, at that point in time, you had to pay to use MP3. He said, that you're paying for this when you could be using AAC. Now, people still want to use MP3. The problem is that those files are so large that they have to either re-encode down to the bit rate of their provider, which doesn't really take away from the quality, but it does, because you're looking at storage space. You're looking at 25 gig in MP3 format at 320. You're looking at less than half of that on a 128K file. So, people want to use it because you can manipulate the MP3 files more than you can the AACP. But as far as audio quality, AACP is where it's at.
And I can chime in from even a content provider standpoint from, for example, like for Live 365 or our sister companies, Empire or whoever else. It's a lot more efficient, not only from an audio standpoint, but from a data standpoint as well. So like if you're transferring less data, but you're getting the same amount of quality, then you're using less bandwidth, and in turn, you're saving a lot of money. So that's our standpoint on it as well. And Jerry, I saw you had unmuted, so I didn't know if you had anything to say there.
No, I would agree. Anytime you can get better quality with less bandwidth, you're going to help across the board, whether it's a slow connection out in the middle of a rural area or, on your cell phone for the mobile users. I think that's the key. Unfortunately, I think MP3s are readily available for many people. And so I think that's why we see those still used as often as they are.
And I think a lot of it is just what people are familiar with. People don't like change. I'm one of those people. I'm still using MP3 on a lot of streams just because change is scary. But sometimes we need to embrace the change. Kind of like when iPhones removed the headphone jack, everybody was freaking out. I don't miss it at all. I don't use the headphone jack on my phone anymore. There's no reason for it. But I think in the long run, just embrace the change, and you got to move ahead towards the future. I couldn't agree more. I think that's about it as far as questions go. I don't see anything from the audience. There's a bunch of people watching, nobody having questions. So I guess that's if that's a good thing with we have answered everyone's questions. So I appreciate you all for joining. Albert and Jerry, Wes, Philip, you chimed in a little bit. Appreciate you guys. Hopefully we can do this again. I know things are crazy in the world right now. So I'm glad we were all able to get together and sort of put together this World Audio Day. And a big thanks to Live 365 for putting this on. It's a absolutely wonderful thing. All the events are getting canceled, so we're kind of doing these, digitally, and it's working out great, and super appreciative. So I'm going to go ahead. Thank you guys.